Hey there, we're on week 26 of season 2 of the Andy Griffith Show. This week's episode titled is Wedding Bells for Aunt B. Barney, what's up this week?
We see Aunt D and Clara walking into Fred Goss's dry cleaning store. And Otis is already in there because he's picking up the suit. And they all start talking about the dance tonight. And Mr. Goss says he'd like to go to the dance. And he asks Aunt D whether she'd like to go with him. And she says she wasn't planning on going. But then he flirts some with her anyway. And then Otis brings his clean suit to the courthouse, and he tells Andy he's planning on being drunk Saturday night, and he's going to be in jail anyway, so he wants to have the suit here to wear to church on Sunday. And Andy says since I'm out of town, Otis is going to have to let himself in Saturday night. And then Otis asks Andy whether he's going to the dance. And Andy says, no, I'm too tired. Barney's out of town, and I've been working double shifts all week. And then Otis tells Andy that Mr. Goss was asking Aunt D out.
And then Clara is telling Aunt B that she shouldn't have said no so quickly to Mr. Goss, because as long as Aunt B stays single and lives with Andy and Opie, then Andy can't get married, because that would be turning Aunt B out on her own, and Andy wouldn't do that to her.
And then Andy jokes with Aunt D about Mr. Goss being interested in her. And Clara says she should invite him for supper and see how that goes. Meanwhile, Opie and Andy are planning to go to Mount Tylet for a Chinese supper. But then they cancel those plans when they hear that Aunt D is going to take Clara's advice, and she's invited Mr. Goss for supper.
And at supper, it doesn't go very well, because Mr. Goss just wants to talk about his business all the time, and he doesn't have much of a sense of humor, and he's all serious and uptight about his business conversation. It's kind of boring and uncomfortable. So Andy goes in the kitchen to talk about it with Aunt B when she's in there.
And in the kitchen, Andy is still trying to build up Fred to Aunt D. Says he'd make a good husband for somebody. But Aunt D doesn't seem real convinced about that. But she agrees to go out with him later anyway to the movies. And as she's leaving on her date, Andy jokes about them setting a date for a wedding soon. And then Fred picks her up, and he's still talking about the cleaning business. And this time he's gossiping about other folks' clothes and talking about how some of them are real hard to clean.
And then Andy talks to Opie about, maybe Aunt B's going to be marrying Mr. Goss pretty soon. And he talks about different kinds of love. There's brother-sister love and father-child love. And then there's a special kind of love, a marrying kind of love. And then Opie goes upstairs to bed.
And then when Fred brings Aunt D home, Andy is still waiting up for her. And Opie hadn't fallen asleep yet, so he comes downstairs, and Andy and Opie has some blueberry pie on the porch. And Aunt D sits with them. And Andy talks about how nice it'll be for Aunt D to marry Mr. Goss. And then Opie says, yeah, she must have that marrying kind of love that his daddy talked about. And Andy says, yes, she does.
But the audience can see from Aunt B's facial expression that no, she doesn't.
Yeah, and then Andy notices that face too. And then they realize there's been a real communication problem. Both Andy and Aunt D were so worried about each other's welfare that they didn't admit that Fred and Aunt D are not a good match.
And so Aunt B is relieved that Andy doesn't want her to marry him anymore, but she's still worried about how she's going to tell Mr. Goss.
And Andy says, leave it to me. So he goes and tells Mr. Goss that Aunt D is making a real complicated dress, the kind that's real hard to clean. But then he points out that Clara always wears simple dresses made out of cotton. And then he says Aunt D is catching cold anyway. So that convinces Fred to ask Clara out instead, and to lose interest in Aunt D.
We missed you in this episode, Barney.
Yeah, I wasn't written into this one, but I'll see you all next week for episode 27.
Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next week for 27.